morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today, we're going to be acting on a request from the lovely AJ Brass over on Patreon. Over on patreon.com/PTCGRadio, if you are on the highest tier of support, you can demand that once a month I make you a video. And AJ Brass said, Wassy, I would like a video about mill decks, the best mill decks ever. And I thought, wow, that sounds actually really kind of interesting. So let's have a look. I'm nominally looking at the best 5 mill decks ever, but we are comparing decks across formats here, so it's not exactly an easy thing to do. Now, for those that are unaware, mill decks aim to win by running your opponent out of cards. If it is the beginning of your opponent's turn and they have no cards to draw, they lose the game. Now, the kind of games I'm covering over on Wassy Plays, like Keyforge and Transformers, have a mechanic whereby if you have no cards to draw, you just shuffle your discard pile, it becomes your deck, off you go. That is not how Pokemon works. Once you have no cards, you lose, ladies and gentlemen. Now, recently we've actually seen the emergence of a mill deck which revolves around Rhyperior. Now, I'm not putting this on the list because it's a little bit new and I'm not sure it's quite good enough. But the Rhyperior from Burning Shadows has a very nice ability whereby when you evolve it, you get to discard the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. Interesting, of course, because a little while ago we had an Aggron which had the exact same ability. Like, literally the exact same ability. It's the one from Dragons Exalted. So, I'm not sure it's going to be quite good enough. The fact you can use super boost energy to pay the attack in one go is nice, and I like this, but I don't know if it's proven to be good enough yet. Though if I do get a chance over the next few days, I will make a video about this, and when I do, I'll pop a link in the description. But in at number 5, stall decks that use Trick Shovel and Team Rocket's handiwork. Now, there is not one real deck that springs to mind with this particular combination. Trick Shovel was a fun little card whereby you could look at the top card of either player's deck and discard it. Generally speaking, it was just used to discard the top card of your opponent's deck, though you could use it to get yourself a turn closer to drawing a supporter if you don't currently have one, or maybe even leaving your opponent with a top deck that you know they don't particularly want. Team Rocket's handiwork, flip 2 coins for each head, discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. And we saw this played with a whole bunch of stuff. We saw some decks with things like Whale or Giant HP, you can't KO me. I'm going to heal with stuff like Max Potion and try and run you out of cards. But we also saw it with stuff like Sableye, which could use Junk Hunt to just recover all of their cards, so they could be using things like Trick Shovel every turn. And then, of course, they could recover Versus Seeker with Sableye, so that they could reuse Team Rocket's handiwork. It was weird to try and pin down exactly what deck was best with this, but there were plenty of decks that use a combination of those cards to mill you out, but because it isn't really one archetype per se, I'm popping it at number 5. If you, however, do have one archetype you think of when you think of this, comment section is where to go. In at number 4, let's go back to the base set, ladies and gentlemen, and let's talk about Alakazam, Chansey, and Mr. Mime. Now, I did do a video about this a little while ago. I'll pop a link in the description. But this was the original stalling milling deck. The problem is, it wasn't really just a mill deck. It really was more of a stall deck that could win by milling your opponent out of cards. So what we would have here is we've got Chansey. And Chansey's got a huge amount of HP. 120 HP on a basic in the base set days was just absolutely over the top ridiculous. And you could attack with Chansey, we'd play for double colourless energy, but that wasn't really the point here. It wasn't what we were trying to do. We were using Chansey to stall. And then, of course, we would have Alakazam. Now, what Alakazam could do very nicely was move damage counters. It had an ability which nowadays many of you would probably recognise from the Reuniclus, which ended up coming second place at Worlds. And what you could do is move your damage counters around your Pokemon. Because you see, as much as you could use Chansey to stall, what was far better was actually using Chansey to store damage on using Alakazam, and what you would do here was use Mr. Mime. You see, Mr. Mime was kind of a little bit borderline broken, because Mr. Mime had an ability whereby if your opponent wanted to do 30 or more damage, it got prevented. Which means that they would essentially have to do 20 damage, which wouldn't be enough to KO Mr. Mime. Then Alakazam would move the damage off onto Chansey, and you would never KO them. Now you might be thinking, well, surely sooner or later Chansey would get KO'd, but no Chansey wouldn't. Because we had cards like Pokemon Center that could completely heal here. Just take all of the damage off. And that was why this was so gosh darned good. Or we could use Mr. Fuji to shuffle this back into your deck. The point is, this was just ridiculous. But you could make an argument that it wasn't just a stall deck. Chansey had a very nice attack that did 80 damage. Alakazam could attack here. So it wasn't just a stalling deck, but it's the closest we've got to a mill deck in base set, and it was very good, so I think number 4 sounds right. In at number 3, I'm going to be honest, this is a deck that passed me by for an awful long time. It is Tickling Machine and Moltres. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen, I did have to get some information about this deck from a wonderful article published by Jason Glasinski. Yeah, he won Worlds 3 times. I'll put a link to the article in the description. Do make sure you go checking it out. But this really revolved around, wait for it, Tickling Machine and Moltres. So Tickling Machine was a trainer card, flip a coin. If heads, your opponent sets aside all the cards in his or her hand face down, nobody can look at them. At the end of your opponent's next turn, your opponent puts the cards back into his or her hand. But if tails, your turn ends immediately. But then what you would do is you would play Imposter Professor Oak. Imposter Professor Oak says your opponent shuffles his or her hand into his or her deck and then draws 7 cards. Here's the problem. Your opponent has no cards in hand. Ergo, they have to just draw 7 cards. And if you can keep pulling this off, your opponent keeps having to draw 7 cards, and if your opponent draws too many cards, they lose. Back then, a lot of people were using Professor Oak to get set up and draw cards. Problem is, Professor Oak makes you discard your hand, so they're getting closer and closer to decking themselves out if they end up playing that, which is a little bit of an issue. We then had cards like Erica and Computer Error, which give your opponent the opportunity to draw cards, though it does not make them, and that can get them a little bit closer to decking out as well. Obviously, we're still using Chansey here to block, why would we not? But the attack we're really looking for is Moltres, the one from Fossil. 1 fire energy, you may discard any number of fire energy cards attached to Moltres, and then discard that many cards from the top of your opponent's deck. Again, we're just getting closer and closer to getting them to deck out. And this is, of course, very interesting because the Moltres, which is going to be coming out here very soon, has that exact attack. It does come out today or tomorrow, depending on when this video actually gets uploaded. So yeah, that was a fun deck. That was a very fun deck. In at number 2, a deck that I played around with quite a lot back in the Diamond and Pearl era, it's Flygon Level X. Flygon Level X had a just over-the-top dumb Pokebody, passive ability. As long as Flygon is your active Pokemon, discard the top card of your opponent's deck between turns. That means you discard 1 after your turn, 1 after their turn, 1 after your turn, 1 after their turn, and so on and so forth. This is very, very nice indeed. Problem is, it didn't have a great attack. So what you would do is you would rely on Memory Berry here, which allowed you to use attacks of your pre-evolution. Think of it like a Shining Celebi, but as an item card. And from many years ago. But still very, very fun. And then you could use the attack of Flygon, which did 40 damage and gave you immunity the following turn if you could discard a stadium your opponent has in play. But actually, mostly here, we were focused on Trapinch and Sand Tomb. Sand Tomb, 1 fighting energy, 10 damage. The defending Pokemon cannot retreat during your opponent's next turn. You see, we don't care here at all about doing damage and knocking out. We're milling. So we want to trap them in the active. And of course, Trapinch has an attack for a colorless energy, which brings a Pokemon into the active, which is very nice indeed. Though generally here we'd be using Palkia Level X's Restructure, which means that your opponent gets to switch one of your active with your bench, and you get to switch a defending Pokemon with one of their bench here. Back then, everyone was playing Claydol amongst other things, so it didn't have to be Claydol that you targeted here. There's a bunch of stuff that you could target, but generally speaking, Claydol was the target du jour. You would drag Claydol up in the active, trap it in the active using Trapinch's attack because of Sand Tomb, and then they would just lose 1 card from the top of their deck between turns. It was very, very nice indeed. The fact that they lost 1 card after your turn, 1 card after theirs, seeing this in action really was very, very tense and very, very fun. But the best mill deck ever, and I'm sorry it's come to this, and I don't want to say it, it's Durant. Sorry. I don't want it to be Durant. I really wish it wasn't Durant. But I've been sitting here for the last couple of days chatting to people. Huge shout out to the lovely Nick Pierce. Hey, Nick! For helping me out with this particular video. He did send me some resources, have a chat through with me. Nick is, as you should all know by now, an extremely lovely man. And we've been talking about this, and I've been doing some research, and I've been looking over old deck lists and everything like that, and I don't think we've ever had a mill deck like Durant. Durant, for 1 metal energy, discarded 1 card from the top of your opponent's deck for each Durant you had out in play. So you get 4 Durant out, you discard 4 cards from the top of their deck every turn. And then you would combine this with stuff like Crushing Hammer to try and make sure they didn't have any energy, and you would just run them out of energy and then run them out of deck. We had Pokemon Catcher back then, so of course you could, and that was without the coin flip, so you could drag a Pokemon into the active and then kind of laugh in their face. Pokemon Catcher, yeah, little bit silly good with Durant. And it was super annoying. And it would beat so many decks. There were so many decks that just could not compete with this. And I think here's a real difference between Durant and all the other decks on this list. Durant won many tournaments. And I saw Flygon doing quite well at times, but Flygon wasn't up there with decks like Luxray Garchomp. Luxchomp, as many people called it. That was, back in the Level X era, that was the best deck. And there were plenty of formats where Flygon was legal and Luxchomp was just smashing it. There were always other decks around that were significantly better. But in its heyday, Durant was legitimately one of the very best decks in the format. To the point where Pokemon actually printed a Heatmore, which was an extremely blatant counter to it. 1 colorless energy, 10 damage. If the defending Pokemon is Durant, 60 damage plus, of course, weakness. It was a completely shameless counter, although the irony is it came out in the same set as Darkrai EX, and Darkrai EX is what actually killed Durant. And has anyone ever seen a sudden death game that took 25 minutes? 'Cause I have, and it was Durant, and his opponent couldn't take a prize, and my friend Alex Holdway decked someone out in sudden death and elongated the entire tournament by about half an hour. Mill decks have not actually been as much of a staple in the format through the years as many people might expect them, and they genuinely are a slightly newer invention. There's been a lot of stall decks that can win by deck out, but purely mill decks, we've not had that many. Of the ones we've had, Durant is the best. But ladies and gentlemen, if you've got any mill decks you want to talk about, the comment section is the way to do so. So make sure you head on over there. And if you would like to make me make a video, well, ladies and gentlemen, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio. That's where you can do that. Go nuts in the comment section, ladies and gentlemen, but please do remember to be nice. And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at @TheWassy, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all of that, like we've just said, patreon.com/PTCG8Radio is the place to do that. And do make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WassyPlays, where we talk about these other games where you can't deck out. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.